Welcome everybody to the Geeking Poetic channel. I'm your host Larry Roberts, and this is another installment of This Month in Rock History. Now, this is our wrap-up show that we do at the end of every month, basically putting together all of the segments we did each week for this week in rock history. So if you want to get all of your rock history all in one fell swoop, this is the show to watch. However, don't worry, if you prefer shorter videos, we do 1-minute shorts that we feature here on YouTube as well as on our Instagram and TikTok. And while you're at it, why don't you click on that subscribe button down there so you'll be notified whenever we have new content and new rock history videos coming out. So this here is episode 3 of the monthly rock history roundup, and this is about all of the cool rock history things we discussed for the month of June. And without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, so starting us off, we're going to look at one of the new features here on This Month in Rock History, which is where we look back at the Billboard charts from the past. And specifically, we decided to take a look at what was the top 10 singles on the pop radio charts 40 years ago, specifically for the week of June 16th, 1984. Wow, so I was a kid when those songs were in the top 10 back in 1984, and I remember all of those so well. You've got a bunch of classic songs in that list right there, things like Borderline by Madonna, Dancing in the Dark by Bruce Springsteen, Oh Sherry by Steve Perry, Reflex, and Time After Time, but it's interesting to note that there's a couple songs in there that might not be as familiar to people nowadays. For example, do you remember that song Self-Control by Laura Branigan? I think that's a great song, but it seems to be one of those ones that's a little bit lost nowadays. And as you'll see when we talk about these top 10 lists from week to week, it's really interesting how some of these songs really stood the test of time, and other ones, even though they made it all the way to the top of the charts, they just kind of get lost over time. But they're still fun to revisit and hear again, and maybe, you'll hear something that you forgot, and you end up loving it all over again. Well, moving on to another thing that came out 40 years ago, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the release of a soundtrack album that to this day people still love and find influential. I mean, I find young fans of this album all the time, and it just keeps going and keeps going. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Purple Rain by Prince. This week in rock history, we focus on the 40th anniversary of the soundtrack album for Prince's film Purple Rain. Released on June 25th, 1984, Purple Rain featured Prince and his band The Revolution really firing on all cylinders. While Prince did all of the songwriting as usual, the performances by the members of the band really helped provide a more dense and layered quality to the material. Prince broke new ground with songs like When Doves Cry and Let's Go Crazy, and The Revolution's contributions to songs like Computer Blue and the title track helped take his songwriting and sound to the next level. For many fans and critics, this is one of those perfect albums, where every song is a hit with no filler. And when the movie was released later that week, it wound up being a smash hit. The soundtrack went on to sell over 25 million copies, and the film grossed over 10 times its budget, making Purple Rain a runaway success. Yeah, man, that's such a great album and a great movie. I admit, much like a lot of other people, I was familiar with Prince. I knew 1999 and Little Red Corvette and Controversy and stuff, but I wasn't really all that well versed in Prince until I saw Purple Rain, and then I became infatuated with him. And The Revolution, that was such a great period for Prince. And while Prince ended up doing a lot of great material after that, I really feel like, and I think most people probably agree with me, that Purple Rain was just a peak that could never be touched. Now, going way further back in time, I'm talking specifically 54 years ago, we celebrated the release of one of the most important and influential bands in the heavy rock and eventually heavy metal scene. I'm talking about Deep Purple, their first album that they did with vocalist Ian Gillan and bassist Roger Glover, none other than Deep Purple in rock. This week in rock history, we highlight a landmark album from the band Deep Purple, none other than In Rock. Released in June of 1970, this album featured new vocalist Ian Gillan and bassist Roger Glover, after Ritchie Blackmore decided that the band needed to move in a heavier direction, and the previous lineup just wasn't going to cut it. As such, this album ended up being a big step forward, with many fans and critics considering Deep Purple in Rock as a defining release, and a big part in the creation of the heavy metal sound. Songs like Speed King, Into the Fire, and Flight of the Rat were aggressive and complex, and the haunting Child in Time highlighted Gillan's incredible vocal range. And along with the single Black Knight, this helped to cement Deep Purple as being one of the heaviest and most important rock bands of all time. Yeah, man, there's so many good songs on In Rock. I love them. The Speed King is such an aggressive and upbeat kind of song, especially for its time. I know Deep Purple didn't really consider themselves ever to be truly a heavy metal band, but I have to say, if you listen to songs like Speed King, Black Knight, Flight of the Rat, basically almost any song off of In Rock, you can totally see the influence that they had on other bands that came later, like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, and, you know, the bands that people really considered to be the fathers of heavy metal. Now, jumping a little bit forward in time here, we're going to go to 1989 with another band that was extremely influential on a completely different scene. I'm talking about the debut release from none other than Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. This week in rock history, we focus on the debut release of one of the most important bands from the 90s, none other than Bleach by Nirvana. Released June 1989, their label Sub Pop had initially only asked them to record a shorter EP, but the band had other ideas and instead recorded a full-length record with producer Jack Endino at the helm. Bleach featured their then new drummer Chad Channing, but there were also a few songs on the record that had been done with Melvin's drummer Dale Crover. This also marked a brief period when Nirvana was a four-piece, with guitarist Jason Everman appearing on the cover and in the credits. And even though he doesn't actually perform on the record, he did put up the money for the recording. The album was only a minor underground hit until it was re-released later after Nirvana became popular, and Bleach eventually went platinum. And with its raw sound and rough edges, Bleach wound up being a great debut album that only hinted at the massive success that would come later. So honestly, it's funny, this is one of those bands that I was aware of well before they blew up big with Nevermind. I actually had the Bleach album, and I had other friends that were into that, and I had Nirvana's appearance on the Kiss tribute compilation, Hard to Believe. I already knew about Nirvana, so I was really excited when I found out that Nevermind was coming out, and I was really shocked to hear what a difference there was in terms of songwriting and production with Nevermind. I love Nevermind, don't get me wrong, but I did miss a little bit of that rawness from Bleach being gone. I still love Bleach. I think it's a great debut album. Alright, so keeping it in the 80s, but jumping back a little bit specifically to June 19th, 1983, we took a look at Billboard's top 10 albums on the pop charts.
Thank you very much, oh Mr. Roboto. No one wants jobs, nobody wants to. Now come to the night. Yeah, but it feels so right. Oh, is it? Watch out for it, chew you out. What can get to sleep? The songs they're playing on the radio. Got a photograph, picture of Russell Killer. You're fighting for your life inside a killer. Oh! She's a
Wow, and again, we're looking at 41 years ago, but so many of those albums on that chart are still considered to be pretty influential and pretty important these days. 1999, Flashdance, Pyromania, Frontiers, Thriller, it goes without saying. Of course, everybody knows Thriller. Like, those are some big albums, and people still love those albums. It's really amazing when you look at these charts and you realize the amount of classic music that came out in the early 1980s in a relatively short period of time. And even some of the albums that maybe people aren't as familiar with nowadays, like that Men at Work album in there, Cargo. That's a great album. If you haven't heard that, I suggest checking it out. All right, now we are going to set the Wayback Machine way back. We're going back to 1966, because in June of 1966, there was an album that came out, at least here in the United States, even though it didn't come out everywhere else in the world. But it was a very important and controversial album that came out that month. I'm talking about Yesterday and Today by the Beatles. This week in rock history, we focus on a controversial album release from the Beatles, none other than Yesterday and Today. Released in June of 1966, this saw Capitol Records continuing their tradition of putting out Beatle records that were a hodgepodge of songs taken from singles and other UK releases, which reportedly infuriated the Beatles. In addition to these songs that had been omitted from the American versions of Help and Rubber Soul, it included recent singles like Yesterday, Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out. They also added 3 songs from their upcoming album Revolver, but mostly this album is remembered for the controversial Butcher cover, which outraged DJs, parents, and even some fans. This resulted in a massive recall of thousands of records, with a tame new cover image picked as a replacement. But copies of the original did get out to the public, and they are now considered huge collector's items. And while this album is an oddity, many fans who grew up with this record in the US remember it fondly. Right, so as was just stated, Yesterday and Today was one of those releases that came out in the United States but did not come out over in the UK, and so for most people it's not considered an official part of the Beatles' back catalog. However, for those of us that grew up here in the United States back then in the 60s and the 70s, we didn't really know those UK versions. We knew the American versions. So our versions of a lot of those songs and how we know them come from the American releases. Yesterday and Today, that was one of my favorites when I was a kid. There's so many good songs on that one. And Your Bird Can Sing, Dr. Robert. It's a great record. I never had the Butcher cover. I have to admit, anytime I'm anywhere at a resale shop or a record show or a garage sale, if I come across that record, I am always checking it to see if it has the Butcher cover underneath the sticker. And so far, I've had no luck finding it. But if any of you have ever found a Butcher cover out there in the wild, when collecting or anywhere, record show, yard sale, anything, let me know. I'd love to hear your stories about it. So moving on to an old story from 1975 that is somewhat heartbreaking and sad to recount. We take a look back at June of 1975 when Pink Floyd was in Abbey Road Studios recording their Wish You Were Here album, and they suddenly and unexpectedly got visited by somebody from their past. This week in rock history, we look at a strange and rather sad incident that occurred to the band Pink Floyd. In early June 1975, they were recording the masterpiece that was to be Wish You Were Here at Abbey Road Studios. This process was described as being torturous, as the band was feeling emotionally and physically drained at this point in their career. They then found themselves joined in the studio one day by a strange man. He was overweight and pale, with all of his hair shaved off, including his eyebrows. He gave off a strange energy, and the band couldn't figure out who he was, when suddenly they realized it was none other than SYD Barrett, their former leader who'd been let go years ago due to his deteriorating mental health. They were shocked, and Roger was brought to tears at the sight of his old friend, enhanced by the fact that they were currently working on the song Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which was written about SYD. He reportedly spent a couple of days in the studio. Sadly, that ended up being the last interaction the band had with SYD Barrett. Man, SYD Barrett is such a tragic story. It's such a shame to see somebody who was so full of life and so creative just end up going down that way. Any of the interviews or stories I've read where they've talked to the other members of the band, everybody seems to really remember Sid mostly with fondness, but also a lot of sadness. And I think that David and Roger were really upset that they couldn't do more for their friend after a while. And yeah, it's crazy to think that that visit in the studio was really the last time that Pink Floyd had any kind of connection at all to Syd Barrett. And yeah, it's just sad. All right, so we're in the home stretch here, and we're going to wrap things up on a more positive note. We looked back at 39 years ago, specifically June 29th, 1985, to see what was in the top 10 of the Billboard Pop Singles chart. Wow, yeah, and there you have it. Look at that chart listing. I mean, there are some songs on there that in my book are absolute classics. Things like Everybody Wants to Rule the World and Raspberry Beret, Heaven by Bryan Adams. Those are all great songs that you still hear a lot on classic rock radio today. But then there's some songs that are also great, but you just don't hear as much. I mean, Things Can Only Get Better by Howard Jones. I love that song, but man, you don't hear that one as much. Or the Mary Jane Girls. Do you remember the Mary Jane Girls? Yeah, they've kind of become a little bit forgotten by a lot of the public out there, but man, that's a great dancey song there. Yeah, again, it just goes to show that just because something makes it all the way to the top 10 of the charts, it doesn't mean it's always going to be remembered by everybody forever. And yeah, that's another reason I like to revisit these charts, so that I can hear these songs again and refresh my memories of how much I loved these back in the day when I was a kid. All right, and that wraps it up for us with this month in rock history for June 2024. Yeah, we looked all the way back at the mid-60s and then brought it all the way up to the very end of the 80s, right at the dawn of the whole 90s alternative grunge scene. There's a lot of change that happened in that amount of time, and we only barely scratched the surface of what happened back in the month of June over the various years in rock and roll history. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we missed. We would love to hear from you. What could we have talked about? What important albums or events happened in the month of June throughout rock history that you think we should have talked about on here? Make sure you leave us a comment down below. Come and join us on Instagram, TikTok, and on Facebook, where we have a group called the Geeking Squad group, where we talk about all this music stuff as well as all the other things we focus on this channel. Basically all the things that Gen Xers like me love. Toys, comics, sci-fi, action, horror, classic sitcoms and TV shows, all those kinds of things we talk about over there at the Geeking Squad. It's free and easy to join on Facebook, so hopefully we'll see you there. Meanwhile, do not forget, like I said earlier, hit that subscribe button down below so you'll know when all our new content comes out. In the meantime, we will be back very soon with more rock history goodness for you. I suggest you go and you find your old Walkman, put your headphones on, listen to that old Footloose soundtrack or Journey or something like that, and just relive the old glory days for a little bit, you know. Have a great summer, everybody. We will see you at the end of July. And yeah, rock and roll. Peace out. See you, everybody.